Welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here. Is there anybody this is their first time to one of our presentations? Good, great. Oh, great, good. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoy this, learn a lot. Is there, oh, and I also want to make a special thank to our presenters today, because they've spent a lot of time and giving all of their wonderful knowledge to us. And so I really want to thank them for being here today. How many people came here to learn about water today? Yay! You're in the right place. How many came here just for the cookies? A few of you, I knew that. So we have a table in the back that April made on our upcoming events, and so we're going to save just a tiny bit of time by having you go back and there's flyers out that you can also get. Are they at the tables? And see what we have coming up. Lots more fun. And we won't be going, we won't have presentations in July and August, just so you know that. Let's see, what else? And also, if people here are interested, we do have a number of advocacy groups going, and if you talk to somebody that looks like they know something, like April or Beverly or Tom or Steve or Pat, just ask them about the advocacy groups, and we'll let you know something about that. So I'm going to start out by reading our guiding principles for Kitsap Environmental Coalition. We acknowledge our presence on the ancestral lands of the Coast Salish people. We build community by forming honest, respectful relationships with all people affected by KEC's work. We use scientific data and inquiry methods for decision making. We support nature's well-being locally and more broadly within the Pacific Northwest ecosystem. We embrace inclusion and recognize we all bring different experiences, talents, perspectives, and strengths to KEC. So we're going to start out, we've been adding some little bit of artistic endeavor to our meetings. Art and nature are very closely connected. And today, I don't know how many of you know John Williams, but he has a little table in there that talks a little bit about his magazine, the Salish magazine, which is an amazing place to go to find out about local, what do I want to say, environmental issues. He can tell you more. Anyways, it's a beautiful magazine and with lots of information. And did you want to say anything, John? He brought a slideshow for us to look at today.
Thank you. I just wanted to mention, and this was mentioned in the flyer they sent out, that every quarter we publish a different theme. And we send out a call for submissions for that theme ahead of time. And we're looking for a managing editor for each quarter to respond to the calls, to respond to the submissions and proposals and the drafts. And we have some volunteer editors, so this managing editor would then assign different drafts that they receive to different editors and supervise the process of getting them all edited and working with the author and whatnot. So we're looking for somebody to do that for either one quarter or multiple quarters, and it's a volunteer position. So if you have any thoughts about that or would like to get involved, let me know. Thank you.
So, and one of John's probably ways of communicating is his nature and media. So that's his way of conveying the importance of nature and environment. And so I'm going to start this and turn the lights out.
Here we are in Kitsap County on a small stream. We have no large rivers. There's no mountains. There's no snowpack. All of our small streams are rain dependent, often hidden away from view, either in the forest or in cities where they've been put into pipes where they find a path to Puget Sound. That's why we need to do a lot of restoration and protect what we have remaining. A soft round egg rests in a nest of river stones. Who would care for the egg and baby when she hatched? I will, said Frog. I will, said Rabbit. I'll take care of the tiny egg hiding in the river stones, said the Beaver. The tiny egg wiggled, twitched, and squirmed. Not a frog, not a rabbit, no beaver to be sure. The tiny fish hatched from the egg and swam up from the river stones. Now who will care for the baby fish and its river home? We will, said the girls. We will, said the boys. When beaver chomps, we'll plant some trees and watch them grow, so beaver can chomp some more. To build a dam, a beaver pond, and a home for baby fish, safe from hungry eyes.
Oh, that's really cute.
I'm standing on a beaver dam that is a healthy beaver dam. You can see it has vegetation on it. And what the beaver do is when the water's changing, when it's coming up or going down, they'll do dam building. It just triggers them, the sound of running water. And they'll come here and you'll see fresh sticks and mud on top where the water goes through. But right now the water's so low, there's no activity. They have a channel to the water that they can enter from the water side for safety. Because they're quite vulnerable on shore. Lots of things get them. Coyotes and dogs kill them, bear. This is classic coho rearing water. They have to live in the watershed about 18 months before they go to sea. So typically they'll move upstream or downstream to one of these areas. They've evolved with the beavers so they can actually navigate beaver dams. And then they get in here and they eat all the little macroinvertebrates that are in there, and they get eaten by some birds, and it's all an ecosystem. There's water underneath us right here, and the reason is the trees caught it. As it fell, it soaked into that ground. It's in that ground right now like a sponge, and it's oozing out under our feet. That's the water table. This is the water that we're going to be drinking in a few years, and the water that's going to be in Chico Creek as it slowly lets go and follows the terrain out to the sea.
Rain gardens help creeks like Owawa Creek. Now with the rain garden, not only is it drying up some of the water, but it's cleaning the water so that when it goes down to the salmon or to the creek, that it's not so dirty.
Did you know more and more people are growing a garden? So let's get outside and enjoy nature.
We had at that time about 5,000 fish. They were chum. We spawned them ourselves. And with the ownership of the kids, they're putting their salmon in the stream. And in 3 years or 4 years, we told them they could come back and see them. And they did. It's been a very solid program for 27 years.
And just amazing to get down there and just be able to sit down and just watch them as they swim away.
Yeah, and I remember going down to Al's and you look over the bridge and you try to see and I think, oh, maybe that's, a salmon that she released or when I was younger that I released that's coming back now. Or you see people fishing them and think, hey!
There's a bear that hangs out around here.
And you get your occasional eagles flying around.
A lot of times we're outside at school, we actually see the eagles as they circle around the creek. We can see them from the playground.
To be like with my kids, I try to tell them, you don't have to kill all the bugs or the creatures. Just makes you more aware of fragile little lives.
Fluffy! Come here! Come here, Fluffy!
That was wonderful, thanks. Sorry, I'm not a very good IT person. Okay, our next feature tonight is Ben Harrison. Are you going to be ready, Ben? Where is he? Oh, there you are. More or less. Do you want me to have Don go first? Or?
I wouldn't mind if he's ready.
Are you? Do you think you're ready to go? Okay. April? Oh no, Beverly.
Yeah, right here.
Where are you? We're trying to keep close to our schedule, and Carol is trying to. She's got a 5-minute sign back there.
Okay. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Don Fenton. He's one of the leaders of the, I'm not close enough, forgot the rule. Don is one of the leaders of the community group out at Island Lake. It's called Friends of Island Lake. And he and a group of others from that group are also part of KEC's neighborhood collaboration group, where there are several neighborhoods that have groups like Don's that are talking to one another and sharing ideas. So that's been a great advantage for many of us who are involved in different groups. So they have been active for several years now to try and protect and preserve the environment at Island Lake. Now, how many of you know where Island Lake is?
I don't.
Pretty good number, but not everybody. So it's a small lake located north of Silverdale, and there's a county park there on one end, and then at the other end is where there was a former children's camp that was sold to a developer in 2021. So Don will be talking to you about some of the complications of the development that is going on there. So I've gotten to know Don and other leaders of the Friends of Island Lake over the last few years. One of the things I love about this group is their very diverse range of skills of the people that are in the group. And Don is one of those even-tempered, smart, resourceful people, and he really knows how to search out information from many sources. And I learned that that's partly because he used to be a title insurance officer, and he knows how to find information. So he's been a great resource for the group, and so he'll be talking about some of the issues, especially related to water. So thanks so much, Don, for being here.
Thank you, Beverly. Thank you, Beverly. I'm going to move over here so I can have my cheat sheet out. My name is Don Fenton. I've been a resident of Island Lake for about 50 years. My wife's been at the lake for 52 years, so we've seen a lot of changes happen through those years. Some good, some bad. One of the good things was, as Beverly mentioned, there's a nice county park that's about 23 acres on the waterfront, nice swimming area, fishing pier. We were really happy to see that go in rather than a bunch of condos on the lakefront. I'm going to go through a little bit of the brief history of Island Lake. Thank you. This is a picture of a portion of the original government survey that was done in 1864 that shows Island Lake, and then coming down from Island Lake is Barker Creek. Those are two important water bodies in our area. Barker Creek is a fish-bearing creek. Island Lake is about 45 acres in size right now and about 35 feet deep. Back in 1864, I've kind of calculated that it was about 8 acres larger than it is now. The lake is fed by rainwater runoff. There's also, on the northern part, there's some unnamed streams that are seasonal that provide water to the lake. Barker Creek runs from the lake, and the lake is the headwater for Barker Creek, and it runs down, Barker Creek runs down to Dye's Inlet, which is down by Silverdale. It's kind of between Tracyton and Silverdale, if you know where that is. Next slide, please. So with the population growth that occurred in the 1980s, we've started noticing some changes in the lake level. We started noticing times when the lake was very, very low, and we got really concerned with that. And at first we didn't know why it was doing that. Later we found out that Silverdale Water had put 3 wells into the Island Lake aquifer that the lake sits on top. And those wells in about 1985 or 86 began pumping a lot of water to supply the northern part of Silverdale. We became really concerned. About 1990, we started noticing very, very low lake levels. And so we investigated a little bit and found out that the water being pumped from the lake was, from the aquifer was probably affecting the lake, but we didn't know that for sure. We still don't know that for sure. In that same time frame, there was a development on the north end of the lake by the county park, and if you go to the next slide, the developer allowed this turbid water that you see on the left here to run into the lake, and it ran for several months. And we, as residents, tried to get the county to do something about it. They drug their feet, they made them put in some straw hay bales, a little bit of plastic, but the water still kept, this muddy water still kept running into the lake, and eventually the whole lake turned this putrid brown color, which is similar to what you see up there. Then in 1991, in November of 1991, the picture on the right happened, and the lake receded so much that we thought at that time that we were going to lose the lake. It went down to levels that we have never seen before, and hopefully we'll never see again, but I'm not positive of that. Next slide. So what triggered our concern was one of our neighbors the lake was pretty low. One of our neighbors was taking some lake weeds out, some invasive weeds, and he put his shovel in the shore of the lake and went to lunch. And when he came back, the lake was about 6 inches away from his shovel. He put it in right at the lake level. And then pretty soon, he looked at it and it came back up. So it was just like the lake was having a tide. And we found out that that was probably due to the pumps at Silverdale Water coming on, drawing down the water in the aquifer, thus drawing down some of the lake water. And then when the pumps went off, it would come back up. So during this time, there were 2 hydrological studies done trying to figure out what was going on. They weren't real in-depth studies, but they were at least a study. Both determined that there was plenty of water in the Island Lake aquifer and that there was little connection between the lake and the aquifer, so we shouldn't be concerned about it. We had several meetings with the county to come up with a resolution because the lake kept on going down, and we thought for sure that it was going to be gone within a year or so. No resolution was proposed or come up with. We got very frustrated, so we contacted the State Department of Ecology, and they forced the county to come up with a solution for this problem. There were negotiations going on in late 1991 and early 1992, and the county finally came up with a solution that the county, Silverdale Water, and the Krista camps, which was the children's camp at the south end of the lake, would begin pumping water into the lake each summer to augment the lake level and keep it pretty steady. And they established that it would be between 217 feet above sea level to 215 feet above sea level. There was a well put in at the county park to supply that water to the lake. And through the next 20 years or so, we had problems with flooding when we had a lot of rain and the valve to the camp wasn't opened and our yards would get flooded. This was our neighbors, on the left is our neighbor's house. It actually came all the way into their basement and about 2 feet from their power box. And then, as you can see this year, this was taken in February, how low it is right now. And this is probably the lowest level that I've seen since 1991. I'm very concerned about the lake level this year. So in October of 2021, Krista Camps closed the children's camp at the south end of the lake and sold the property to a developer, a local developer. He sold half of it off for multi-house development, which is now at 324 houses. It started out at 350 houses. We thought for sure that the county would require an environmental impact statement. With all the lake water problems, the aquifer problems, the camp property being a prime piece of property for recharging the aquifer, we didn't think that there was any way that this development could be improved without an environmental impact statement. But we were wrong. The county went ahead and issued a mitigated determination of non-significance, which is called, it's an abbreviated MDNS, and it allows the development to go ahead with some mitigation methods in place to kind of help with some of the environmental issues. However, without an environmental study, they're just guessing as to what the environmental issues are. It wasn't very welcome, and we did appeal that decision. Of course, we lost the appeal. We spent quite a bit of money to do that appeal, but we lost. We did gain some things, but we lost that. So the next slide. So this shows the last 5 years of the lake level. This year is the bottom line there, the 4 dots you can see on the bottom. Yes, right there. And you can see how much lower it is for this time of year than in the previous 5 years. And it's not getting any better. They started pumping on May 1st, and the lake's already gone down approximately 2 or 3 inches, and they're pumping a lot of water into the lake.
Who is pumping water where? What?
The water's being pumped from the Island Lake Park well, and it goes into a little pond that drains directly into the lake. And
why are they doing that?
To keep
what?
it.
Why are they doing that? To keep the lake level.
For the benefit of the residents around the lake?
Well, there's a county park, the residents, it's wildlife, there's fish, there's frogs, there's turtles, there's eagles, there's cormorants, there's all sorts of wildlife in the area.
And is that
Yes.
coming from the aquifer?
Yes, it is.
Do you know then how the lake affects Barker Creek's flow?
The lake hasn't contributed water to Barker Creek directly since March of 2021 because water doesn't flow directly out of the lake into Barker Creek until the lake reaches 217 feet. Once it reaches 217 feet, there's an outflow that's currently blocked, by the way, that goes into Barker Creek. There used to be a valve on that the camp would control, and if they felt like opening it, they would. If they didn't, they wouldn't, and that's caused part of the flooding issues that we had.
Excuse me, but is there any information on what's going on with the aquifer and the ramifications if it drops down?
Yeah, I'm getting to that in just a moment. So you worked right into my next slide. So this is a picture of the lake that Phil Leversher did for us. The lake is on the left-hand side. The line going down is the trending level of the lowering of the aquifer. It's about 6 inches per year, and that's happened over the last every year over the last 35 years. So we're down the aquifer's down about 17 feet. And originally, the hydrological report said there was no connection between the lake and, as I said, and the aquifer. And they said that the lake sat on a perched aquifer. And we think that's probably not correct. But there needs to be studies done to confirm that. But this is what we're looking at. And so we don't expect any reason for the aquifer to continue, not to continue to be mined. There's Silverdale Water is not using all of their water right for that aquifer, and so they don't feel like they have to cut down their pumping at this point in time. Next slide. So this slide shows the number of gallons that are pumped each summer into the lake for the last 5 years. It averages about 30 million gallons of water each year that's pumped into the lake. And granted, some of the wells, the shallower wells further down Central Valley have problems because their level is lowered as well because they draw out of the same aquifer.
So the people who have housing around there, where does their water come from?
Their water comes from,
Like ridge top and...
well, it comes out of the same aquifer. There's 2 wells on the west side of the lake that are they were owned by Rhodes Engineering or Rhodes Development. Now they're owned by Cascadia Water Company out of Whidbey Island. Yes?
How does the new development downstream affecting all this?
The new development is going to affect it because it's going to take away recharge area for the aquifer. Right now, most of the former camp property is treed, and that's all going to be removed. All the trees are going to be removed. They're going to clear cut. The county had restricted the cutting up to 100 feet from the lake shore. The state came back and said, no, it has to be 200 feet, which we were thankful for. But still about 50 acres is going to be clear cut, and all that water, there's going to be roads put in and houses, and all that water is going to go into storm water ponds that they have planned and then dumped into Barker Creek. So it's going to bypass the lake other than about 5 acres that they've directed some water from rooftops into the lake through dispersion trenches. So, of course, people down Central Valley aren't real happy that they're pumping water out of the aquifer and lowering the aquifer, but most of it is Silverdale water. 90% of it is Silverdale water. And as more development comes in, I can't see Silverdale water cutting down pumping from this particular aquifer. So next slide, please. In 2024, the Silverdale Water paid for an update to the hydrological report. And one of the recommendations was that they supplement or amend the agreement to provide more water to be supplemented into the lake. We've had a couple meetings with the county and Silverdale Water. I've sent numerous emails to the county and Silverdale Water, and there's no immediate resolution. That's why I'm so concerned about this year, because the lake's so low. Silverdale Water's long-range plan is to take water from the CK treatment plant, sewage treatment plant, that now goes out into the Port Orchard Narrows, and put a purple pipe up to the lake and pump that water into the lake. And the problem with that is that the water is contaminated already. So the county commissioner asked how we felt about that water being used, and I said we absolutely have no desire to have that water included in the lake. One thing that we were able to accomplish, right now the outflow into Barker Creek is blocked, and we have made an agreement with the developer that they unblock that, and they have signed that agreement. So we're looking forward to that, just in case we do start getting rain again, and you know, we
That's the cause of the floods?
pardon me?
That's the cause of the flood?
The rain? The blockage? Yes.
Ah.
Well, that and that they didn't open the valve. So I leave you with one question, and that is Island Lake the canary in the coal mine for the rest of the county? As the climate changes and we get less rainfall, are we going to start seeing things like this happen throughout other areas of the county? Certainly we hope not, but the sign is not good. So thank you very much. Does anybody else have questions?
This isn't Ben's first presentation here, but he is basically a Kitsap, Bainbridge Island native. He has degrees in geology, computer science, geochemistry, did research in geobiology, microbial ecology, wow, and has a master's degree in public administration from UW. And in 2023 started working, lucky them, for Port Gamble Sklalone Tribe. And he is quite a water advocate, I would say, and has been involved in issues on Bainbridge Island, which you can imagine are even a bigger canary in the coal mine. So, we're going to do a computer switch.
Yeah. Before we go into any of the things that Marion mentioned that I have some experience or semi-expertise with, I'm going to talk about parenting, which I don't have fixed expertise in at all. I'm not sure how many of us do. I'm sure about every once or twice a year, every parent has the experience with hiding candy that has been accumulated for a special occasion, in this case Easter, and you can tell from the Easter egg midden that's in the picture. And the point here, once all of the candy has been unboxed and putting it in places in one's house, is not to keep it from eventually being eaten, but the better that you hide it, the more likely it is that your kids won't eat it right away, or that you won't yourself go and eat the food, eat the candy before it's spent. So what does a stream do to delay how long this treasure of rainfall is impacting systems on the surface. This is what we want to do in stream systems and the management of the health of watersheds, is that rainfall comes within a specific area and it enters a stream and then is discharged in Puget Sound. And when we talk about the ecology of a system, the forests, the riparian systems, the wetlands that are supported by this water, it is more supportive the longer that it stays on the surface. And it infiltrates into deep aquifers, as was mentioned in the case study of Island Lake. It infiltrates better the longer that it is, and the longer it has to stay on the land before it reaches the sound and mixes with marine waters. So, as opposed to hiding candy in the closet, here's some examples. I mean, this is a picture of Hawkshole Creek. The beavers have put a number of obstacles in place, which at the Hawkshole Pond, that creates a long-term ponding of water in that area, and the wetland habitat is very important. And then over time, when the rain isn't falling, then the pond level does gradually decline. Same goes for this beaver pond over in Port Campbell Forest Heritage Park. And same goes for shallow groundwaters. So when water percolates down through soils past the root layer, it fits into the boundaries in between sand grains, essentially, in between particles, and into those interstitial spaces. And depending upon the physical properties of those geological layers, it may contain more or it may contain less water, and depending upon the physical properties, it may be more amenable to groundwater flow that happens. So if we think about a watershed, and I'm going to get back to defining a watershed again in a moment, but if we think of all of the different land in Kitsap on which rain falls, then we can look at some of these differences in land use that impact how long water is retained from when it falls as rain before it gets into a stream system. If it's farther away from the main channel of the stream, you can see the main channel of the stream for Gamble Creek in these sharper blue, in the sharper blue. The farther away from that channel, the longer it has, and the more space it has to migrate into the channel before it begins to discharge into Puget Sound. If it's in a wetland, the same thing. It may seep into a wetland soil or form a pond that can last from for a bit longer. If it's in a forest soil or if it seeps down into shallow groundwater, then it's no longer a case of storing the rainfall for a day. It's a case of storing the rainwater for months or even a year. And then, of course, deep groundwater, if we're talking about Kitsap, although we're not going to talk as much about the deep groundwater aquifers, the scale of that sort of storage of water in the deepest aquifers of Kitsap is longer than 1,000 years. If you're talking about one of the deep production wells by KPUD, the water that it is pulling up entered recharge from rainfall roughly 25,000 years ago. But these processes, these differences in land use, are something that we can track through data. So this actually isn't from Gamble Creek. This is from Anderson Creek between Bremerton and Port Orchard. But if I take a record of these two time series of data of rainfall by rain gauge over by Bremerton Airport and a stream gauge measuring the flow in Anderson Creek, at the same time, they've been in line. Once the rainfall comes down within the watershed, and there's a lag period before the stream starts to respond to that, and also a lag between the peak of rainfall and the peak of the discharge, and that's essentially the amount of time that it takes the water, on average, to flow from where it's falling on the land surface and entering the stream system. And this is mostly for water that is running over the surface or percolating down into soils or shallow groundwaters and then migrating at relatively shallow spaces. Down here is something that we call base flow. This is more the contribution of groundwater into a particular event. So in each rainfall event, there is some percolation down into shallow groundwater systems that is contributing to the increase in the amount of flow that's going through a stream system. And then we can use a mathematical calculation to distinguish what is the contribution of groundwater and what is the contribution of surface flow. And then if we make changes in the land use, particularly making the surface less permeable to the percolation and infiltration of water, then that changes the features of flow that we can measure. So putting this this description back into a schematic, we've often seen these descriptions of the water cycle. Of course, in Kitsap, we don't really worry about mountain environments where there's storage in ice and snow. We are, in Kitsap, entirely dependent upon rainfall and in terms of the form, almost entirely dependent upon rainfall in terms of what feeds wetlands, streams, and infiltrates into groundwater. But where I was talking about groundwater flow and stream flow, I was emphasizing this process of infiltration and percolation into the shallow layers. Streams are generally fed directly by interaction with this sort of level of the soil and shallow groundwater. Rainfall percolates down, migrates laterally, and then there's a direct seep usually at a contact between, usually at some sort of geological contact, which allows the water to move out of shallow groundwater and back into the stream system. But that's happening more or less through the entire reach of the stream until it discharges into Puget Sound. Sorry, I advanced that a little bit fast. And that's somewhat distinct from the water that we tend to use in wells, which is usually coming from deeper geologic horizons. Also, feel free to stop me and raise your hand and ask for clarification if you need it. All right, so defining a watershed. A watershed is all the area that drains into a body of water. And that can be, if you're talking about Puget Sound, basically the watershed of Puget Sound extends from the east slopes of the Olympics to the west slopes of the Cascades. If you start walking and keep on walking uphill until you can't walk uphill anymore, then you're reaching a peak, and then you're reaching a ridge. Or at a peak is a drainage divide. On the other side of it, you're in a different watershed. So if we take a little snippet of the Kitsap County mapping of watersheds, this isn't mapping every single watershed, but most of the major ones. It shows a different perspective where the watershed is defined by all the water that is flowing into the mouth of a particular stream and all the land area that flows into that particular stream and stream over land. These can be mapped just based upon the terrain. So water flows downhill, and shallow groundwater mostly flows in a very similar path. So a watershed is defined by all the area where downhill flow will eventually end up at that stream mouth. And this is particularly important because there is this connectivity within a watershed for shallow surface waters, whether you're talking about streams or wetlands, then what is downstream is influenced and impacted by what is upstream. Similarly, if you change the land use management within a watershed, then there are downstream impacts of that change. And there are many important, we find that there are very significant thresholds where changing the overall surface of the watershed starts to have progressively larger impacts upon hydrologic and therefore ecological function. So this is from a review article just sort of showing some of these impacts of the differences in a water budget between a forested landscape and a developed landscape. Going back just a little bit to water management here, we're seeing this completion of the water budget between evapotranspiration. So the water is evaporating, heading back into the atmosphere, coming out as rainfall, it's flowing over the surface. It's talking about all of these, and then there's the process of percolation and infiltration down into groundwater. So this is just and these are summaries of the changes in the budget as a result of different levels of impervious surfaces within a watershed. If at 10% to 20% imperviousness, for example, what is calculated as runoff. So this, from a rainfall event, runoff is essentially how much water is immediately lost. So if it's saying runoff is 10%, then the amount of volume that falls within a watershed, that 10% of that is essentially falling close enough to the stream channel that it simply flows into Puget Sound and essentially at the same time as the storm event. But then at higher levels of imperviousness, that runoff fraction increases. It also starts to decrease the amount of water that is returned to the atmosphere. And in each of these cases, there's also a progressive decline in the amount of water that percolates down, that infiltrates down into deeper aquifers. And if we think of the changes, the other development changes that happen within a watershed, these also change the function, sort of the hydrological function. We can think from a relatively undeveloped forested landscape where there's sort of a seasonal stream into a wetland area. You go in and develop it, you don't want the land to stay saturated because it's not good for building. You might turn that seasonal stream into a ditch. It might become a little bit more, might hold water a little bit more permanently, but you're going to dry out a certain amount of the landscape around it, and that water will leave the system faster. We can think of other examples of sort of one key one is if you're increasing this impervious surface. All right, I thought I had another slide closer than I do. So if you're increasing this impervious surface, then you're increasing the volume of water that arrives in a stream system for a storm event faster. So the total flow and intensity of the water in the stream can get higher than it has been in that system previously. And the more flow that you have in the stream system, the more erosive power it has. The more erosive power it has, it can start to cut down farther into the grade of the material that it's lying in, and that in itself can lower the water table. So and this is an example, for instance, of you can have feedbacks of where a change makes an impact and then that impact gets worse, essentially. Sometimes you can have negative feedbacks where the system does go ahead and adapt. So in the example that I mentioned of eroding more, that's going to make the slopes of the material of the stream channel more unstable and slide into the system. You're going to get more woody debris falling into the system because you've made the trees unstable next to the stream channel, and the system can adapt to some degree if we let it. Often, when we're developing, we don't. But looking at Gamble Creek watershed for a second, we can use these sorts of analysis of overall land use to sort of judge the health of a watershed. In the case of Gamble Creek, it's actually pretty good. These are remote sensing data sets that just look at essentially the vegetation and the changes that have been happening. In Gamble Creek, this example of going from darker green is sort of natural forest land over to a slightly different remotely sensed forest designation, sort of more mixed forest or sort of shorter forest, because those are areas that were harvested and then have been starting to regrow. So this is a remote sensing data set between looking at the changes in this watershed between 2001 and 2021. At the same time, we can sort of analyze at this coarse resolution areas that have been converted to relatively impervious surfaces, and that's what you see on the right. There have been a lot of these large-scale assessments of land use within Kitsap. This map on the left is from something called the Watershed Characterization Project. It was done back by the Department of Ecology back around 10 or so years ago. And that is basically looking at the intensity of development and the change to some of these recharge processes I've been talking about that impact stream flow so directly. Also that sort of, if we look at a not completely exhaustive set of the major stream systems throughout Kitsap, and Kitsap speaking of the peninsula broadly, and look at the average amount of impervious areas within these watersheds, we can start to get some assessment of what is the condition of these watersheds and how can we start prioritizing ways that they should be managed the same way or how they should be managed differently. And this is just a bit of a summary of that basic analysis of how much of the land has been converted over to relatively impervious surfaces. When we're talking about watersheds that are well beneath 10%, these are in relatively good and relatively better condition to sustain hydrologic function. When we're talking about more urbanized watersheds at 15% or above, then we see major changes to hydrological function and consequently major impacts to aquatic species and habitat.
What's the time period here?
This one is from 2021, so I included it in part because it's a little bit more updated than this. So the information is available from that remote sensing data set, for instance, to look at the changes from 2011 to 2021. There's another era of very similar sort of satellite-based land use analysis that's coming out soon. And that looks at some of the specific changes. The Anderson Creek watershed that I was talking about in particular, a lot of the area around McCormick Woods has gone into suburban development around the golf course, so that is an example of relatively significant change over to impervious surfaces. And if developers do better low impact development and stormwater management, the impacts can be mitigated to some degree.
The second paragraph there, what is referred to as key thresholds?
Yeah, that was the 10% threshold I was mentioning before. 10% is actually a pretty significant, is a reasonably accepted one that's been that threshold has been mentioned in management guidance from the EPA as just one of the points where we see significant changes in function. I'm trying to remember thanks so much for bearing with me on some of these. I was, as you can tell, I wanted to talk a little bit about deeper aquifers if I still have a little bit of time. So all of what I've been talking about so far is more the function of shallow aquifers and stream systems and wetlands. We're talking about shallow water storage. Deep water storage is more impacted. These aquifers are essentially fed by their connection with shallow water aquifers. So the water first has to percolate down into shallow aquifers, and then the connection between deeper aquifers and shallow aquifers is how these get recharged. But generally this recharge is happening at specific areas around the peninsula. If you think about Kitsap Peninsula, most of it, with some very notable exceptions, most of the geology underlying the Kitsap Peninsula was laid down by glacial action back by many cycles of glaciers moving south and then north across the landscape. And all of this relatively beige or orange area is something known as glacial till, which is very fine-grained and cohesive and relatively impermeable. Whereas these bluer areas and yellow areas are more glacial outwash sands. So they're relatively more porous and they're relatively more permeable. So if you look across the landscape there, we can begin to put together an idea of which areas are contributing more and which areas are contributing less to long-term storage of groundwater. And it's really important to recognize these areas in terms of how, for example, we might capture some of the additional winter precipitation and allow it to infiltrate down, how we might do some of the managed aquifer recharge projects where water is treated enough to be clean enough to be reintroduced into shallow aquifers and support recharge, or also just how we plan development such that the most important areas for sustaining hydrologic function are not developed. And there's a little bit of an example here. If you've ever seen some of the groundwater models that are put together, the idea of recharge is essentially based on, this was one of the basic science studies that feeds into that model. It's analyzing the amount of precipitation, increasing precipitation in a few watersheds, and the amount of recharge that actually happens based upon differences in land use. And they mostly found that in this case, that the main controlling factors on recharge was whether the till was there and whether the land was forested or not. This is kind of an oversimplification for our purposes, but on the first pass, it's actually pretty good. So this is getting into a little bit of why I was talking about. This figure was put together it's hard to, this is part of a strategy planning document for salmon restoration for the east part of Kitsap County. And I was helping essentially do that process of identifying areas that are more favorable to recharge. And in this case, those are the areas that are mapped in the hashed green, and that's basically those outwash sands I was talking about before, where they overlap with soils that are more favorable for infiltration. So speaking of that geological mapping, hydrological modeling I was just mentioning, this is one example from the U.S. Geological Survey back in 2016. They were doing a region-wide model of changes to Kitsap Peninsula in terms of groundwater levels, in terms of one of the relatively shallow aquifers. This is the QA1, you might hear it referred to sometimes as the sea level aquifer. And the purpose of these hydrological models are sort of to put together a working model that mimics reality enough based upon a simplification of the geology that's present. I was talking about the glacial till or that wash sand. So where those are, where the streams are, try and sort of give this model enough input and then make it sort of reflect what we observe in terms of the water levels that we see in wells or the water levels that we see in streams. And then once the model is behaving well enough, then set it up to simulate some future scenario that we're interested in. In this case, say a 15% reduction in recharge to simulate drought conditions. This is also sort of a feasible or a plausible scenario for certain kinds of climate change. Not so much total decrease in annual precipitation, but a change in the seasonality of the precipitation can also have an impact on recharge. And then it was looking at changes in stream flow and changes in the aquifer water levels as a result of that. This is what I was talking about in terms of climate models. This is from the UW Climate Impacts Group showing changes in that overall the annual precipitation change is not that significant, but the change in summer precipitation is very significant in most emission scenarios. So that is, so that we need to, and that sort of broad regional change and its impact on the fundamental processes, hydrological processes of each watershed is something that we need to identify. We need to be monitoring the changes in respect to climate and development. And then, but many of these changes are very specific in how they, in some of these criteria that we value most in terms of, say, the loss of stream flow or wetland areas. This is going to be a very watershed-specific impact that needs monitoring and local management in order to overcome not just the challenges of development, but also the challenges of climate change. And that's it. Thank you.
Kitsap is knowledgeable and prepared to deal with those climate change variance and seasonal rain, and I know that's kind of a evaluation or something, but
yes and no. I mean, Kitsap has specific challenges. We just had, I don't know if anyone noticed, we just had Bob Ferguson the other week announce this Washington's Water Future Initiative to start talking about changes in maybe in our overall response to water management, and I think that that's pretty welcome. But a lot of the emphasis there was on, say, the current issues and emergencies that we're having with drought, and the current statewide drought, it will get, the current projections for the summer, we will start feeling it as well, but right now Kitsap is feeling it less because the drought, as we understand it at the moment, is more a snowpack drought. We have the snowpack, both in the Olympics and the Cascades, is extremely low for this time of year. And that's a combination both that it wasn't restored far enough and that we've had enough warm temperatures up in the mountains that it has melted way too soon. So that's going to impact stream flow coming into the summer. But I think that it's sort of, I'm straying away from your original question there, but I'm gonna, what I was gonna say about the knowledge in Kitsap is that there's, and we talk about things like that, that 2016 USGS study. There's been a lot of really good work done assessing Kitsap water management, and there are some very, and there's a lot, and there's some good coordination between different stakeholders in it who are having that conversation. I think that there are tools available to manage water better, and that we know enough now on how to do things better than we have in the past. Whether we actually do that is going to be more a matter of political will than it is about our knowledge, I would say.
So I'm familiar with the snowpack and how that affects the water over in the Olympics, but then how does that affect the water over here? I was wondering, because like the Salish Sea is there, and is that actually influence some of our water? And does some of the water from the Olympics flow underneath the Salish Sea, or how's all that work? I don't really understand any of that.
Mostly not. Most of the hook now is deep enough so that we don't really think of there being as much of being that much of a meaningful connection even in the deepest aquifers between the Olympic Peninsula and Kitsap Peninsula. Pretty much all the water that's feeding our surface waters and our groundwaters is rain that falls on Kitsap Peninsula. In the back.
One of
One more.
One of your slides compared the infiltration rates of forests to impervious areas. How would mowed grass or native meadow fit in relative to a forest in those rates?
Native meadow would generally be more favorable for infiltration, but the use of how that soil has been compacted and how it's treated and what the underlying geology is does make a big difference. Generally speaking, the best approach is to have more native vegetation, whether it's shrub or forest, in terms of better function.
My way of explaining it is water is hard. It's a very complicated subject. So we're just going to go ahead and go on with bring Joe up, and if you guys feel, if anybody feels they need to make a trip and get some coffee or something, feel free to do that. And, are you ready, Joe? You go ahead and introduce him while I get to it.
Hello, I have the pleasure of introducing Joe Lubisher. He's a local woodworker and water resource engineer. Since retiring, he has worked with a great group of North Kitsap Heritage Park stewards, serving as a chair for several years before promoting environmental restoration and soft trails. Development near the park raised concerns that led to joining KEC's work on critical area regulation. That development was Arborwood. Joe is a relative newcomer to the Salish Sea country, quite aware that his almost 50 years in Kitsap County pale in comparison to centuries-old giants and millennia-old cultures. His dream of living with the ocean in his front yard and the mountains in his backyard evidently came true. Today, Joe Lubisher will give the lowdown, and I mean that seriously, on how the State Environmental Policy Act, that's SEPA, and the county's Critical Areas Ordinance, that's CAO, are applied or not in Kitsap County.
1 hour version. I had it on the 1 hour version.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Since you've been sitting for an hour and a half, please do feel free to get up and coffee up or brownie up, as the case may be. Due to the time constraint here, I'm going to have to change the talk a bit. It's basically regulatory, and what I want to try to do is highlight some of the impact of what we've done over the last 3 years in these different development issues and some of the wins we've had, and identify some of the areas that we need some more work in the future. Now, can you all hear me in the back? Lynn, is that good? Okay.
Could be louder.
Could be louder. How's that?
Better, yeah.
Okay. This picture is my reason for being here, and I'm sure you have all your own. We've got increasing population with a limited land base and limited infrastructure, and that presents a lot of challenges. The regulatory framework is tough,
It's expensive, it's slow, but it's what we have to work with and create our own points of leverage. So go ahead. There are three main things I was going to talk about today, but the State Environmental Policy Act, called SEPA, the Growth Management Act, often referred to as the GMA, and the county's Critical Area Ordinance. Okay. If you look at the SEPA in the middle, you see the three types of decisions that get made. It's either a DNS, a determination of non-significance, a mitigated determination, or a determination of significance, which in turn requires an environmental impact statement. That's the first regulatory step that citizens have an opportunity to weigh in on. Now we go down, the second opportunity is when the Critical Areas Ordinance comes into play. The CAO was required by the GMA, but both SEPA and CAO, the State Environmental Policy Act determination and the Critical Area Ordinance rules are local. It's Kitsap County or Paulsbo or Bremerton that is our point of leverage, and really the only point of leverage. Okay, skip that. So the storyline here is basically we've got a lot of development pressure, but the state property rights are very strong. There's a lot of fear of creating a taking that or the local jurisdiction might be sued on. But we do have some environmental laws. Developments do have to be permitted, and that's where we come in. And one of our chief problems is what I call the fact that the county and the consultants for the developers are compliance challenged, and it can be pretty simple, and you kind of wonder how that happens. So, given that, we only can resort to our pitchforks and torches, or perhaps your emails and checkbook. But especially formal comments and formal appeals. That has gotten KEC's cred, has gotten us some respect down at DCD, down at the Commissioner's office. It's something that don't take lightly. That's really important because we're getting, director, assistant director of DCD to listen to us. We're getting the commissioners to listen to us. And every time you talk to your commissioners, they hear that. So let's keep doing that. Okay. This is probably a decent example of what's so frustrating about dealing with the current system. This is from a wetland mitigation report for Arborwood. In the report, the consultant had, this is a small part of a stream map, and you'll notice this is the east fork of Crabapple Creek, and it's got two branches at the bottom there. When the consultant did the mitigation report, and when the engineers did the civil report, here is the main fork of the creek. They completely left out a tributary. Wow, completely left it out. So that's pretty bad on the consultant's part, but it's equally bad that that was never caught by the planner. It seems that the planners give a lot of respect to whatever the developer gives them. They say, this is from the experts, and we have to honor that. So there needs to be a better review on part of DCD's part. So this is kind of an aside, Critical Areas Ordinance terminology. I'm using the example of a wetland here. The idea of protecting a wetland ecosystem is to put a buffer around it. Various rules, you get a wetland, and then you define what is called a standard buffer, okay? It's regarded by ecology as moderate in nature, not necessarily fully protective, depending on what element of the ecosystem you're looking at. The CAO then allows developers multiple ways of reducing or modifying that boundary. So instead of, say, a 200-foot buffer, you end up with a 150-foot buffer, completely legal. And if that doesn't work for allowing your zoning and full use of your property, then the developer can go through a process with the hearing examiner and reduce it even further, even down to 25 feet. And that would be what is called either a variance or reasonable use process. Okay. I'm going to jump to SEPA, okay? And this is so this up here is the definition of what SEPA looks like. A significant adverse environmental impact for which mitigation cannot easily be defined. That's a very general consideration, okay? And it's very different than the critical areas ordinance. By comparison, the critical area ordinance is pretty specific. And the value of jumping onto a project very early and using SEPA is that you're not limited to challenging whether a specific law, specific rule in the CAO is followed or not. If you can make a case that there is a significant environmental impact and they're not going to mitigate it, you know, that's where you want to jump in, because it'll be too late later on, okay? Just 3 points on how the county almost always issues a DNS, a determination of non-significance. It's also, after they give a notice that they're going to give a determination, you only have 2 weeks. And there's a concurrent comment and appeal period. So you have 2 weeks to try to get DCD to listen to you and decide whether you're going to make an appeal or not. It's way too short. That's a piece of the law. It's in state law, but it's something we might be able to get the county to quit using. Lastly, there's a tendency, and we saw this with Public Works in the North STO study, there's a tendency to evaluate the SEPA criteria by using the CAO criteria. Does that make sense? That people will say, well, if you pass all the CAO rules, then we'll give you a DNS for SEPA. You know, it doesn't work that way, but that is how the county at times looks at it. Where are we at time-wise? 20 more minutes. I'll just explain this one as by way of complaining, if I may. This was north of this is south of Kingston on Kingfisher Creek. The gray dash line represents the existing land surface. There's a salmon stream in the bottom of it. And the parcel owner wanted to put a road across there. And this green line would be the road surface. So this is the plan, is to put a round steel culvert in the bottom and then fill up the whole channel. The only problem with this, and this is the code up here, and the consultant wrote that in their report. So if you have a stream with salmon, you have to have a bridge or bottomless culvert. And she said, and the consultant wrote, well, we're just going to put in a round steel culvert and everything will be fine. I mean, go figure. In this case, there were 3 comments about this issue that got put in, which included the tribe and Fish and Wildlife, and this project hasn't gone anywhere. So, you know, the value of getting early on. Okay, let's skip that. All right, so this part gets into a little bit about how the CAO is structured. Next. All right, so by state law, there are 5 types of critical areas, and these are 5 chapters in the CAO. There are wetlands, fish and wildlife habitat conservation areas, just think of that as streams and small lakes, geohazards, frequently flooded areas, and critical aquifer recharge areas. I'm just going to talk about a couple of those. Chapter 200 and 300, wetlands and streams. That's mostly what I have dealt with, and they overlap frequently a lot, and the rules are similar but different, so it can get really confusing. So it makes sense that those critical area ecosystems of streams and wetlands overlap. And where those different buffers overlap, you need to meet the rules in both Chapter 200 and Chapter 300. That, unfortunately, is an issue of contention right now. One of the points in the Superior Court appeal case, the county and the developer are saying that, well, whichever buffer is wider is the only one that you apply the rules on. Now, that's true for setbacks to construction. It's not true environmentally. And so hopefully we're going to win on that one. We shall see. Okay. I'd also like to make a quick comment on critical aquifer recharge areas. So the code does say it seeks to protect water quality and quantity, but in fact, the only thing it does, and that's for aquifer water quality, is it limits certain land uses in the Category 1 areas. So if your gas station, dry cleaner, potentially polluting land use, that is normally prohibited, but we can get around that too. With water quantity, there are no protections in the code, okay? There are no consideration of cumulative impacts for water quantity either. It's a huge hole in the CAO. And Don and I ran into that at the Island Lake hearing. And the hearing examiner basically said, well, there's nothing in the code that's concerning about water quantity. You can't raise the issue. So we're stuck on that one right now. So this is a prime area for changing the code. Okay. I'm going to give you my analysis of the critical areas ordinance in three parts here. Kind of basic concepts, what I call pejoratively loopholes, and then the positive constraints. So, basic concept is that critical areas have functions and values, and the purpose of the code is to protect those functions and values. Okay? And one way that's done is by having buffers, which apply to especially wetlands and streams, also geohazards. The confusion comes in kind of twofold. One is that buffers also have functions and values. They provide habitat, they provide hydrologic benefits. So there's been this kind of thought process that it's okay to destroy the buffers because it's really the critical area, the stream or the wetland you care about. And that, it doesn't have a good scientific basis, And indeed, both the GMA, the Growth Management Act, and the CAO, their definition is to protect critical area ecosystems. So when you're looking at the plans, this is a different kind of argument, but it's in the code and it's something we can lean on. Okay, so we already mentioned these particular three critical areas do have buffers. In streams, they're called riparian management zones, RMZs. The loopholes are basically the many ways that, and Kitsap County has got about as complex system for allowing encroachments that anybody can have. And then lastly, the good news is that mitigation is required for encroachments and losses to the ecosystem. Okay, let's go and skip it. So, one more. Okay, so loopholes, I kind of break these into four groups. One we call exemptions. The CAO doesn't apply. That would be for emergencies, existing structures and such. The second category here is actually a good thing. This is new in the 2024 code, that the DCD can require an increase or enhancement of an existing inadequate buffer, which is really nice because, you know, now the bad buffer bonus that is gone. That's not part of the code anymore, and they've gone the other way. This third set is the 4 types of encroachments that you can do. And the first 2, buffer averaging and administrative, is what I call modifications that require a mitigation. These next 2, the variance and reasonable use, are basically where a property right would be lost, there would be a taking. And so in that case, there'll be an encroachment without mitigation. And lastly, there's a chapter, especially in wetlands, called Additional Development Standards. And this is kind of tricky because the county and the developers are saying that you can use one of these additional development standards and skip a buffer modification up here. And that's a problem because in Washington law, it's not legal to interpret a code in a way that makes another part of the code meaningless. Okay? So, example, a developer wants to put a road in and they say, well, we don't have to bother with doing buffer averaging because we're doing it as a road. You know, it just doesn't make sense. And that is probably going to have to require some kind of code changes to make sense out of it, but it's not an appeal item at the moment. Okay. Constraints, good things. So basically, the idea is that full mitigation is required for all impacts and losses. So one of the points we're able to make is when you look at a wetland mitigation report for a wetland or a habitat management plan for a stream area, you can raise the question, is the mitigation adequate from a biologic point of view or from a hydrologic point of view? And that's where you need to go before the hearing examiner and bring in your experts, your wetland specialist, stormwater engineer, hydrogeologist, and the examiner will listen to that. He certainly has listened to us at some of these hearings on those issues. In mitigation, there are kind of 2 things we can take a look at. One is that this thing called mitigation sequencing has to be followed. It's laid out in the WAC, the Washington Administrative Code. It kind of makes sense, you know. If you can avoid an impact, you got to do that. If you can't avoid it, then you minimize it, and on down through. And no matter what you do, you end up having to monitor it. At the same time, there's other specific requirements in any given chapter that has to be met. And one of those is the no net loss criteria. Now, there's always kind of been a criteria in the 3 previous visions of the code, but the term no net loss is now much stronger in the 2024 code. It's not used in the various reports we've been dealing with the last 3 years, but I think we're trying to make a case that it has to be used now, and they're going to have to make a biologic requirement of why their mitigation ends up being adequate, right? So it's a newer tool. It's used in some other jurisdictions like Bainbridge Island, but not in Kitsap County yet. So that's something we'll be looking at. In general, so these reports I mentioned, the special reports, I was the geotech, wetland mitigation, habitat management plan. basically they're not very good about identifying impacts. In fact, some of these reports simply say, oh, we have an impact, we're going to replant, we're done. That's it. And, you know, when you impact a buffer, what happens? You clear it, right? Take off all the vegetation, then you strip it. You take off all that valuable upper soil level, you know, that's got all the protists and the fungi and the bacteria, the plant roots, the insects, the mammal burrows, you know, all that just very valuable life, plus also very valuable for hydrology, because that disturbed, that biologically disturbed soil is very good for absorption and for infiltration. That's gone, right? And then they come in and maybe do a cut, but they bring in fill and they compact it to 95% of its theoretical compaction level, which really destroys infiltration and absorption. So it's a huge amount of damage. And we took that to the hearing examiner at Arborwood and basically won there, right? Because we're saying just saying that you're going to replant is not adequate. So we can expect that that's going to still be an issue at other developments. On the hydrology end of things, the wetland specialists and the geotech engineers are just, they're not adequate. And I mentioned number 3 already and number 4 as well. Okay. Skip that. One of our big wins was on this temporary impact theory. So you saw the drawing a minute ago, where you've got a wetland and you've got a standard buffer. The county and the consultants have said that, oh, we can encroach on this buffer because it's merely a temporary impact. You know, and there was no authorization in the code for that. There was no mitigation specified. We fought that over 2 long appeals. I mean, it's 2 weeks of hearings at Arborwood, and we won on that. Let's see. Go ahead. One more. Okay. So this is the decision we got, which it said that a major change in the analysis was a determination that the applicant's temporary impact theory is not authorized. The examiner even called it absurd because it was contrary to the whole purpose of the CAO to protect critical area ecosystems. Go up to the other one. One more. This is an issue that's being brought up at Royal Valley. So here we've got a wetland, and this yellow line going down is the wetland boundary. The green line here, my hand's not very steady, that's the standard buffer boundary. Okay, and then the blue and purple is where the buffer is being encroached on. The purple, the wetland specialist is saying, oh, we're going to have a permanent impact there, so we'll mitigate it. And in between this blue check, they're saying, oh, that's a temporary impact. We don't have to do a mitigation. It's crazy. It doesn't make any sense at all. But I expect that that's going to change. We shall see. Okay. So go up 2 more. 1 more. All right. This is a really new item. Only a few of you are probably aware of it at this point. Was it year and a half ago, a few of you, Doug and Elizabeth, made comments at a hearing for a variance of a single-family residence. It was up on Carpenter Creek, right? The examiner added a number of environmental conditions because the buffer had been reduced to basically nothing. And then last November, December, the property was the construction was finished, the property was sold, and we noticed, oh, it doesn't look like they followed the conditions, right? So we filed a records request and took a look at the property again, and indeed. So a complaint was filed with DCD, and though it wasn't strictly a code complaint, it prodded DCD to take a look at it. There were 3 covenants that should have been filed. There should have been a fence on the buffer boundary. Instead, it was put further out into the yard. It was pretty gross. And subsequent documents we got showed that DCD did not have any process for tracking hearing examiner decisions and conditions. This is the magnitude of that mistake. I mean, it's just hugely significant. It's kind of unbelievable that the county would not be doing this. And the legal advice we've gotten from our in-house KEC attorney is that, well, there's no question that you have to follow this, be a hearing examiner. So there's several things now. 2 of these are at Royal Valley. And we're kind of in the process of talking to DCD and talking to the commissioners. It's just kind of getting started, and we'll see how we go from there. And lastly, just run through these some reference resources and the sort of things that one needs to look at when you get hold of a project. And I'll emphasize again, it's so important. Kathy Lustig is really good about finding this information, and you know, there are several of us now that have gone through these multiple processes. But in general, next, there's this MRSC, Municipal Research Services Center. It's a website that provides non-political, unbiased analysis of what the laws are intended to do and how they are supposed to work. It's a really good starting point for almost anything dealing with state law. Okay. On the county level, there's a parcel search program, there's a permit portal webpage, and then you can file records requests. And those are all absolutely necessary things to learn how to use. Okay. This is another little win we got. Let's attribute this to the assistant director at DCD. Don and I were talking to her, and we said, hey, when we go onto the permit portal, all we see is the first submittal round. And this has been this way for years. Second, third, fourth submittal rounds, public never had any access to. Right? So now, on the permit portal, you can see more of the history. So it's turned out to be an easy thing for them to do, but you know, they needed to do it. Okay, next. For stream mapping, there are 2 sources you want to look at. The Wild Fish Conservancy website, they do a lot of the water typing, and that determines whether it's a type F fish stream or a type N non-fish stream, whether it's seasonal or perennial. And then there's also, the DNR has a hydrography map, and it's got similar data, but Wild Fish Conservancy, where Wild Fish has data, it's usually better than DNR. And there's a process for getting new data into DNR, since DNR is sometimes regarded as the legal requirement. And again, Kathy recently succeeded in doing that with Anatai Creek, so she's our expert on that. And lastly, if you get serious about looking at the CAO, I have assembled some concept areas. So like I've basically gone through the code and assembled some basic concept issues, you know, critical areas, buffers, function and values, put those all together in one place. Similarly, I did that with different types of mitigation. I've done it with the no net loss, et cetera. So that's available if you want it. Okay. Yeah. So that was the 30-minute version. I've got a 4-hour version.
Questions? Yeah.
Before we go to the questions, I just want to quickly, in fact, say, if you thought what Don Fenton said earlier was important and what they're doing at Island Lake is important, if you think what Kathy Lustig is doing at Save Enitai is important, if you think what's going on at Central Valley United is important, or what Joe is working on at the Arborwood Appeal effort. KEC is a fiscal sponsor of these 4 projects. So you could send a donation that's tax deductible to KEC. You can identify it for the project you're most concerned about. And we will help pay some expenses for those projects. And so I just want to let you know that you can also send letters to the commissioners, of course, but if you want to help through donations, that would be fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. So it's 5 o'clock, so if anybody wants to slip out, I just want to thank Sue for this amazing set of pictures she put together, and Marion and Tom for helping me work through the presentation. Okay, Martha.
So your data sources, what if you want information on deeds?
On deeds.
Yeah, well, how do you get that?
Auditor's office.
What?
Auditor's office. They
You
have
just
all
go to
those
the auditor's
records.
office and you ask for,
You can go online at the auditors and do searches for documents related to the given parcel.
or you have to have the parcel number and then from that you go backwards to find the deed?
Parcel number is a good way to start.
Well, what if you don't have that?
They're very helpful.
On the parcel search, you go parcel.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Next, in the back.
I wondered if you could just explain a little bit compensatory mitigation.
Explain what?
The compensatory
Compensatory.
Oh, compensatory mitigation?
Yeah.
So the term compensate sometimes gets used equivalent to mitigation, but technically, if you completely destroy a wetland, you have to do compensatory mitigation. And if you have to destroy a buffer, the same thing. And that, there's a process for doing that, and there's lots of information on that. April?
I was going to maybe try to help answer that, but I might not be correct. So if you destroy a wetland in one area, you may get credit for, quote, creating a wetland in another area.
Right.
That's what
Yeah,
I thought.
if you destroy a wetland or buffer, you need to replace it somehow. That replacement seems to be a key term. In the back?
Yeah, so regarding that, so Fred Meyer's in Port Orchard was put in about 35 years ago. It was a wetland, and they paved over Paradise, and now there's 6 high-rise, apartment buildings. And did they have to mitigate it as much back then, or has laws really increased since then?
I think that's in the city of Port Orchard, so I can't speak to that directly, but the county code for the critical areas ordinance, we're on our 4th version now. There's 1998, 2007, 2017, and 2024. It's been strengthened every year. Pat?
Well, on that compensatory wetland mitigation, so are you talking about like a mitigation bank?
So ideally, when you do compensatory mitigation, you do it in the same area, in the same watershed, for example. But there's also out-of-kind compensatory mitigation, and a mitigation bank would probably fall into that category.
So that's when they're just taking they're mitigating it with a degraded wetland someplace else, and so you upgrade that wetland and you get to count that as your mitigation.
That's correct. There is a net loss, when we look at our whole environment.
Yeah, that doesn't seem right. I mean,
Well, yeah. Catherine?
This information is so incredibly useful. And thinking about our own situation in Paulsbo, where our neighborhood was trying to fight an issue that the city was doing, it's like learning a new language, right? Most people don't have the capacity to start trying to figure out how to fight back. And so I wonder how successful KEC has been in terms of around the county sharing this information with neighborhoods that are concerned about development happening.
Yeah. So on the one hand, emphasize again that as soon as you hear about something, start looking at it right away, because early knowledge and early action is very effective. The KEC has been organizing a separate set of meetings. They call it the neighborhood meetings. So people from Royal Valley, from Arborwood, Anatai, Island Lake have been talking to each other. So, there's kind of a core of people in KEC that people can tap as a resource, absolutely.
That's great.
But we could use more.
Tom?
You mentioned the fact there are no protections for water quantity.
Right. No protections for water quantity.
No protections for water quantity. Does that not suggest or imply the need for restriction on development or limitations on development? You and I have both heard this number. I have no idea if it's real or not, but someone expects 70,000 more residents in Kitsap County by 2050. If we're already low on water, how do we put this together?
Yeah, well, that's a topic of conversation, and it's not just about water. So, for the Central Kitsap wastewater treatment plant, they're talking about increasing their pollutant load to Port Orchard Bay by 1/3 over the next 20-ish years. And it's already been flagged, semi-permanently on bacteria and nutrient level problems. So that's one issue, is getting good enough water quality treatment, because you're going to be increasing the volume of loading if we don't improve from a secondary to a tertiary treatment system. Ecology's been, I guess you could say they've got their head in the sand over that issue. And you add that to stresses on water quantity, and then you get into the conversation of should there be moratoriums or not. Steve?
First, I'd like to say how much we appreciate your hard work in this area. Tremendous service for the citizens of this county, and we really appreciate it. The second thing I'd like to kind of ask you is, I know that you've been working with the commissioners and with DCD and trying to form relationships that, and I think you've been pretty effective at that. But I want to know how much the commissioners see the problems that are occurring with DCD and the lack of enforcement of these rules. Tough question.
Well, let's just say you're running a fine line there between overburdening the commissioner with making them aware of what's going on. So, like we say, we do have, a couple of new commissioners that have, Warren Brute's been listening to some of his citizens. Commissioner Rolfes has certainly been listening to some of our concerns, but they still need to be pushed. Even if they totally agree with us, they still need to be pushed. And all those little, when you have meetings and you have the opportunity to put something in their ear or send them an email, that adds up over time, I think. We also have a new director of DCD, and he's been there pushing emails, maybe.
Yeah.
He's expressed his interest in being transparent. He's been pretty responsive so far, but again, we still need to keep pushing. So, thank you, sir.
Yeah, that's just a basic question, but when a developer acquires a parcel and there's some question about whether or not it's a wetland, they have to hire a biologist to come in and evaluate that. Who does this biologist work for?
Exactly.
Okay, so the question is, how do you get a wetland identified and rated, and who does it? So the county recently, in its permitting system, created a new thing called PREP to quickly provide permits for builders according to the new state law that penalizes the county if they don't do it fast enough. One of their steps is an environmental check. So they look to their wetland map, and they will be able to, this is their position, they can say, well, your property doesn't have a wetland on it, and there's no wetlands within 500 feet of your property or something. The problem is that wetland mapping is woefully inadequate, okay? They've agreed to put some additional permits on, but at their rate, it'll probably take them 10 years to catch up with the last 20 years where they neglected it. So if there is this reason for looking for wetlands, they have to hire one of the many companies that do that kind of work. And it's really laid out well in Army Corps of Engineers documents about how you go about delineating a wetland, and the 3 requirements for making it a wetland, and then rating a wetland. And once you do that, then you can define what kind of buffer width is required. So that's a pretty set and dry thing that's been in place for a couple decades. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
I do want to just comment on.
We're behind you.
Well.
Carol.
Yeah.
Carol?
I was just going to answer his question, is that the biologist works for the developer.
Yeah, that was evident in these developments around Paulsboro.
Yes.
So how much should we trust?
We don't.
Okay, but when you raise that with a hearing examiner, in particular, in 2 parcels recently in Paulsboro, it's kind of dismissed.
There is agency deference. Deference. So if DCD staffing has always done it that way, that's a legitimate reason to allow it.
Yeah, most of the wetland reports, people have found mistakes in them. I don't think those are necessarily intentional mistakes, but it can be worthwhile to have a more senior wetland specialist review work that has been done. However, I will add, as I mentioned earlier, they're woefully deficient in looking at the hydrology of the sites. So that's a sensitive point there. There are a number of companies that have got some really good people. But you do have to step out and bring them in as part of your team. Okay, Carol?
Okay, let's take the Carpenter Creek case as an example. I sat in on that hearing. I minimally participated. It's always, number one, in Kitsap County seems to be the same company that does these assessments, these biological wetland assessments. Always the same company. Number 2, when we laid out our concerns, just like you said, they listened. And then the finding is, and Carpenter Creek, understand, this parcel is 75%, I believe, wetland. It had a Carpenter Creek along one edge and wetland in the front of the parcel. Obviously not a good place to build a house.
Yeah.
Obviously, obviously, they were going to have to mitigate the buffer, which they did in a most grotesque manner. When the hearings examiner came out with his finding, he said, well, this would amount to a taking of property rights, so no problem.
That's true.
That's absolutely true.
Every property in Kitsap County it is developable.
There is a mismatch between zoning and the desire or goal for environmental protection. It's a foundational mismatch, there's no question, and I don't have a thought yet on how to handle that.
You change the,
Tom?
I'd like to remind everybody here that wetlands is a big word, and it includes all sorts of water bodies of varying degrees of importance. Amphibians are the most endangered class of vertebrates on the planet. We've lost nearly half of them in my lifetime, and they will breed in a pond the size of this table. And they develop a great fidelity for that breeding pond. For 7 inches long, it's hard to find a pond when it's time to breed. So you go back to the one that produced you, whatever the size, whatever the origin. Tire track ponds are a perfectly valid wetland to save because there is a subset of amphibians that know that pond, that is their natal pond, that's where they have always reproduced, and when you remove it and build another pond somewhere else, this is the fraud of mitigation. They don't know where that pond is.
So bringing that back to the wetland definitions and level of protection, there's been some improvement, but basically smaller wetlands are kind of downgraded. They're considered not so important. The idea that a string of small wetlands through the woods it has important ecological values is not recognized in the code. And so that's an area that could still be improved. So thanks very much, everybody. You stayed over time.